Yoma, Dafim Yud Beis, through Yud Ches. On Daf Yud Beis, the Gemara is discussing the question of who owns Yerushalayim. Which Shevet owned the city of Yerushalayim? The Gemara says there is one opinion, one brisa holds, Yerushalayim lo nischalka l'shvatim. Yerushalayim remained the property of all of Klal Yisrael. It wasn't given to any specific Shevet. Where do we see this? The brisa says, Ein maskirin batim b'Yerushalayim l'fi she'eina shelahem. People who had houses in Yerushalayim could not rent them out because the houses are not really theirs. Yerushalayim wasn't given to any particular shevet, so the houses are not really theirs. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok Omer, af lo mitos, we don't rent out beds either in Yerushalayim. Lefikach, because the landlords weren't taking rent for their houses, therefore, in lieu of that, oros kadashim, the hides of the animals that the pilgrims, the Oli Regalim, brought as karbanos, bali ushpezechaninan, notel nosam bizroa. The landlords would take the hides by force because they weren't collecting rent. This halacha that Yerushalayim lo nischalka l'shvatim and ein maskirin batim b'Yerushalayim. So Rambam brings this. Rambam says that there are various halachos that are mentioned about Yerushalayim. One of them is that ein maskirin b'socha batim. One of the various unique, special halachos Yerushalayim has is that people who have houses in Yerushalayim can't rent them out. The Mefarshim note that despite the fact that the Rambam codifies this halacha without comment, we don't follow this halacha b'zman hazeh. People who have houses in Yerushalayim most certainly do rent them out. So the question is why? The Gemara says you can't. The Rambam says you can't. So the Mefarshim give various reasons. One reason suggested by the Kaftar Referach is that the Gemara says they weren't getting rent, but instead the landlords would come and they would take the hides of the kudshim. So that was fair. At least they got some compensation. Bizman hazeh, there are no kudshim, there are no karbanos, and therefore they are entitled to get rent. Perhaps this is not mashra for the Rambam. The Rambam says that just brings the halacha. It doesn't say that bizman hazeh, it's different. But Mari Kurkus also, in addition, objects to this for another reason. He says the Gemara never said that taking the hides is why they can't charge rent. It's a consequence. Once they can't charge rent, they used to take the hides. The reason they can't charge rent, the Gemara says, was because it's not theirs. It was lo nischalka l'shvatim. Mefarshim give other reasons. One reason is they say that today the houses all belong to the non-Jews. That the Jews were there at the pleasure of the non-Jews. Mari Kurkus himself works with this reason. He says that when the Gemara says people who had houses in Yerushalayim can't rent them out, they weren't paying for the houses. They were just living in the houses for free. So the Gemara says they shouldn't be charging the tenants, the Oli Regalim, because the houses were collectively owned, they weren't really theirs, but bizman hazeh, where the non-Jews have possession of Eretz Yisrael, and every Jew who's there, the regular landlord of the house he himself has to pay rent to the non-Jew, or has to buy it from the non-Jew. So certainly, it wouldn't make sense that he should have to allow a tenant in his house for free. If he himself has to pay money to the non-Jew for the privilege of living there in the first place, certainly he can pass along that cost. He's allowed to charge his tenant, when he sublets, so to speak, he's allowed to charge that tenant bizman hazeh. That reason wouldn't necessarily apply bizman hazeh. Bizman hazeh, we don't live in Eretz Yisrael at the pleasure of non-Jews. We have the country as the citizens of any country hold their country. So that reason wouldn't seem to apply. Mari Kurkus gives another reason. He says that we don't have a chiyuv of aliyah l'regel bizman hazeh, that the chiyuv of aliyah l'regel applied bizman habayis. Again, even though Chazal said the reason was Yerushalayim lo nischalka, he's willing to say that part of the reason was that it was because of aliyah l'regel, and that doesn't apply bizman hazeh. Again, Rambam didn't make such a distinction, but that's what he suggests. We find other Mefarshim say this as well. Other Mefarshim say that the reason Chazal said they shouldn't charge rent is because of Oli Regalim, that they were afraid that they would take advantage and gouge the Oli Regalim. So that reason also does not apply bizman hazeh. So there are various reasons the post can give for why we don't follow this halacha. It's not clear that all the reasons they give apply bizman hazeh either, and the Rambam doesn't make any exceptions, but certainly the minhag is, the accepted practice is that people in Yerushalayim do charge rent for their homes, despite what the Gemara and the Rambam say. On Daf Yud Gimel, we have a Gemara. The Gemara actually begins on the end of Daf Yud Beis. The Gemara talks about a case where the Kohen Gadol developed a psul. He saw a carry, became unable to do the avodah on Yom Kippur, so they appointed a substitute. So the question is, what happens when the first one recovers from his problem and is now able to do the avodah again? So the Gemara on Yud Gimel brought a machlokas that the first shita, Meir shita, said the Rishon is chozer lavodaso. The Rishon goes back to his position when he becomes suitable again, but the Sheni retains the status of kuna gedola. Rabbi Yossi says no. Rishon chozer lavodaso. The original Kohen is reinstated, and the Sheni can't be anything. He can't be a Kohen gadol or a Kohen hedyot. Then the Gemara brings Rabbi Yossi brought a proof from this. He brought an episode that occurred. This once happened, and the Chacham said Rishon chozer lavodaso. The Sheni can't be a Kohen Gadol or a Kohen Hedyot. He can't be a Kohen Gadol at all, Mishum Eva. It would cause dissension between him and the other Kohen Gadol. Can't be a Kohen Hedyot because Mal Mekodesh Lo Maridin. So both Tanaim agree, Rameir and Rabbi Yossi agree that the Rishon is reinstated when his psul passes away. The question is, what happens to the Sheni? Then the Gemara in Yud Gimel says, right at the beginning of Yud Gimel, the Gemara says, Halachic Rabbi Yossi. We paskin like Rabbi Yossi. Tosfos right away asks, there's a principle, Hilchos El Mashicha. Elsewhere, the Gemara says, we don't paskin halacha on questions that are not applicable b'zman hazeh. Halachas that are only relevant l'asir lavo limos Mashiach. They were relevant when we had the Beis Hamikdash. They will be relevant when Mashiach comes, but they're not relevant today. The Gemara elsewhere says Hilchos El Mashicha, that we don't paskin halacha in such cases. Tosfos debates whether that's really true or not in such an absolute way. But Tosfos' first approach is to say you're right. We don't paskin Hilchos El Mashicha, but this machlokas actually is relevant halacha l'maisa today. How is this relevant? We don't have a Kohen Gadol. We have other types of people who have positions of honor and authority. Someone who's a parnes, someone who has some kind of position of power and authority over the community. So if he, for some reason, had to be replaced temporarily, and now the problem, the onus, passes away, so we paskin like Rabbi Yossi, that the Rishon is reinstated. You give the Sheni covered, the Sheni still gets covered, but the position is returned to the Rishon, to the original one, when he becomes able to serve once again. Whatever reason he couldn't serve, when that reason goes away, the first person is reinstated. Similarly, the Mordechai says, they asked the Maram, a person used to have a certain mitzvah, a certain kibud, and apparently the way it worked was he used to pay for the kibud, but it was his privilege to pay for the kibud. He would be the one who would get it and pay for it. And then for a while he couldn't do it, he was too poor, or for some other reason he couldn't pay for it, someone else used to get it. Now he has money again, he's rich again, he wants to go back to buying this kibud. So the psak was, it depends why he didn't do it. If he simply chose not to do it, he became less interested for a while in paying for the mitzvah, even if money was tight. But if we judge he could have afforded it and he chose not to, then he forfeits the right and he can no longer get it back. But if he really couldn't, he was really an onus, he was simply too poor to afford it, then he does not forfeit the right, and if he ever becomes able to go back to his position of buying the kibud, then he's entitled to it. That's how we paskin in the Shulchan Aruch, that if someone had a certain mitzvah and was temporarily unable to do it, as long as he didn't deliberately choose to forfeit it, he has the right to be reinstated when he becomes once again able to do the mitzvah. Mishnah Berurah brings this other din as well, of the parnes, based on our Tosfos, the parnes who couldn't do the job because of an onus, he gets to be reinstated. And not only that, but we don't give the second, his replacement, we don't let him have any aspect of the job, because that would cause Eva, as the Gemara says. However, we still have to treat the second one respectfully. What does that mean, respectfully? The suggestion is we give him another job. The parneshood has to go back to the first one totally. We don't split it because of Eva, like the Gemara says about Kohen Gadol. But the second person should be respected, and we should give him a consolation prize. We should give him some kind of other position of respect in a public way. On Daf Yud Daled, the Gemara talks about the payas, the lotteries that they would hold to award the privilege of doing different avodos, different parts of the temple service to the Kohanim. Payas Hashlishi, the third one, daily was Chadashim L'Ktares Bo Ve'Fisu. Anyone who is new to the Ktares, who has never done Ktares before, should come and join the lottery for the Ktares. Like we have today, certain lotteries we say you're only eligible if you've never won. So Ketares, other avodos, you were eligible even if you did it before. Ketares had a unique halacha. You weren't eligible if you did the Ketares ever before. Why not? Rashi explains, based on a Gemara later in the Masechta, no one ever did Ketares twice because Ketares had a segula. It would make the person who performed the Ketares service rich, and they wanted to give other people a chance to get rich. In a famous halacha, the Ramah brings, in the name of the Maril, that when it comes to honoring someone to be the sandak, the person who holds the child at a bris milah, so the Ramah says that it's a mitzvah, it's a privilege, and he says also, a father shouldn't give two of his children to one sandik when he has different children who get a bris, and he shouldn't award sandikos of a second child to the same person who got the first one, because it's like Ketaris. The Maril says it's like Ketaris, and only Chadashim look Ketaris, that just like Ketaris makes you rich, so we shouldn't give it Ketaris more than once to any one person. We should spread the wealth around. So to Sandakos, a father shouldn't award Sandakos more than once for more than one of his children to the same person. That's what the Rama brings in Shulchan Aruch. Some Achronim are not so happy with this. The Vilna Gaon sharply rejects this. He says, this is Ein Lehem Shachar, he says, Im Kain, forget one person. There should be a rule that even once someone got to be a sandik at all, for any father, no other father should ever give him sandikos. That's how Ketaris works, he says. And he says and also he says this idea that it's a skula. He says we've never seen a sandik getting rich. I read that they asked Rav Chaim Kanievsky, I think, they asked him, you've been a sandik at many brises, you're not rich. He said his riches are his svarim, his Torah. But the Gaon says that we never saw a sandik getting rich. So the Gaon says actually the minhag is based on a mystical point in the Sefer Hasidim, and the Tavos Rabbi Yehuda Chassid's mystic testament, certain things he shouldn't do, but it doesn't have anything to do with Chadashim L'Ktaris. Rabbi Yehuda has a tshuva. They asked him also about a certain person couldn't find anyone who met his standards for sandak except for someone who he had used earlier as a sandak. Does he have to follow this halacha? Rabbi Yehuda characteristically, repeatedly in the tshuva, grumbles that he doesn't really enjoy discussing things that don't have a clear source in the Gemara, ideas of Rishonim and Achronim that are not based on a clear Talmudic discussion. He's very uncomfortable, he says. This reason, based on Chadashim L'Ktaris, is only in Asmachta, he says, and he repeats this throughout the tshuva. He discusses it at length, but he says it's only in Asmachta. This idea really has no shoresh and ikar in the Gemara. It's only drash and remez. Certainly not ma'akev. It's not a minhag kavua. You shouldn't treat this as a binding minhag, he says. In Poland, people are not medaktik in this. Many places, the Rav HaKavua gets to be sandik everywhere. Even in Arkehili, he says, not everyone's makbid on this. And other Achronim also find various leniencies, various exceptions to this, based on the fact that it has a very tenuous connection to our Gemara. Either it's based on a very tenuous drush based on the Gemara, or it's based on Yehuda Chassid, but it doesn't have such a solid, concrete source. On Daf Tezvav, the Gemara talks about the order in which the dam would be poured on the yesod, the blood of the karbanos was poured on the base of the mizbech. So the Gemara discussing that when you put the dam not on the yesod, but you put it connected yesod, you put it on the two corners that have yesod. So it says when you choose the order of the corners, the Gemara introduces a rule. How do you decide which corner to do first? It introduces a rule called Pinos Shata Pone Lo Yiu Ela Derech Yimin. Mizrach Bereisha Vahu Paga. When the Kohen is standing there with the dam, and he has to decide which way to go, so he turns to the right and then begins to circle the mizbech. Whenever he has a decision, a choice to go right or left, he turns right, and then once you start going right, there's one way to go around the mizbech. So whichever corner you hit first, that's the one you do first. But this is the rule the Gemara establishes when a person has a fork in the road. He has to know which way to go. When he has a choice of what direction to go next, you choose right. This halacha appears in a number of other contexts that are negeh b'zman hazeh. For example, when it comes to the nanuim of the lulav, Shulchan Aruch, there are different opinions in what is the order of the different directions you wave the lulav. The Shulchan Aruch rules that the order is east, south, west, and north. And the reason is because we're supposed to always turn to Yamin. So a person standing with a lulav, so you go Mizrach, and then you turn if you're facing east, and then if you're pointing toward the east, and then you turn to the right, and you turn south. So that's, again, there are other opinions, but that's the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch, that we follow this rule that we always turn to the east. We always turn to the right. Another halacha, this comes up, Beis Yosef brings that when you take the Torah out of the Aron Kodesh and you bring it to the Bima, so you turn either right or left, you turn right. So when you go from the Aron Kodesh to the Bima, you turn right. Then when you return back from the Bima to the Aron Kodesh, you turn right as well. So there's a right way and a wrong way, a right way and a left way that you're supposed to go, and the rule is determined by our Gemara, established by our Gemara, that when a person has a choice, he should turn to the right. The same thing applies when a person is going to the same thing applies when a person is going to ascend to the when a person is going to ascend to the migdal. So a person should take the shortest way. When you're going to do a mitzvah, you should go there as fast as you can. And when you leave, you should take the longer route to show that you don't want to leave the mitzvah. But if both ways are equal, the Shulchan Aruch says, then you go to the right. And the Mishnah Berurah says that he brings this other halacha of the Sefer Torah, and he brings a question. So do you follow the rightward route even if it's longer? He says. Efshir, he says. Anyway, our beam is in the middle. He says so. Then certainly you should go to the right. Certainly you should go to the right. This also comes up in the context of Chanukah. Chanukah poskim say that when a person has multiple neiros in his menorah after the first night, a person should light. We invoke the rule of kalpina shatapon ela yilimin. You should turn to the right. The way some Rishonim learn, the way most Rishonim learn, perhaps the way the common minhag is, we start on the left so we can go rightward. So each time we add a new nair on the left, and we start from the leftmost nair to go rightward. That because we want to be able to turn to the right, so we start on the left in order to turn right. That's the dominant minhag. There were Rishonim who held differently. The Trumas Hadeshin brings that was the minhag of Bnei Reinus, but in Bnei Ostraich he says they used to start on the right and go to the left. And he said and he explains that they held that's called Pona Derech Yamin. To start on the right is called being Pona Derech Yamin, choosing where to start. I choose to start on the right. So they're actually at two minhagim, but the dominant minhag today is to start on the left in order that we should be able to turn to the right. The Biur Halacha notes there are several different opinions in this matter. There are other factors involved as well. People have different minhagim, but again, the dominant minhag is to start on the left in order to turn right. But there are some who start. But there were certain shitas that you start on the right and then you move leftward. On Daf Tazayin, the Gemara brings a Mishnah. It says that the length of the Azara was 187 amos long, and the width was 135 amos. Elsewhere, the Mishnah tells us that the Harabayas, the entire courtyard around the Azara, was 500 amos by 500 amos square. And then the Mishnah tells us very cryptically, Rubom and Hadaram, the largest percentage was from the south. Sheni Lomen Mizrach, to the east was the second. Shlishi Lomen Tzafon, the third was to the north. Miuto Min Amarav, the least was to the west. What does that mean? The most what? The least what? So the Mefarshim generally understand that this Mishnah is telling you where exactly the Azara was within the Harabayas. The Harabayas was a large square of 500 by 500. The Azara, which contained the Heichal, the Beis HaMikdash, was a much smaller rectangle of 187 by 135. And that rectangle fits somewhere in the large square of 500 by 500. Where was it? That's what this Mishnah is trying to tell you about Rubo min Hadarom, Sheni min Hamizrach, Shlishi min Hatzafon, Miyuto min Hamarav. What does that mean, Rubo, Sheni, Shlishi, and Miyuto? So there's a Machlokes Rishonim. The Rambam and many other Rishonim understand that Rubo means that the largest displacement between the wall of the Harabayas and the wall of the Azara was from the south. Meaning that it was relatively far. The Azara was displaced relatively far from the south. Sheni min Hamizrach, the gap between the east wall of the Harabayas and the east wall of the Azara was the second of the largest of the four displacements. Shlishi lo min Hatzafon, the gap to the north was the third largest. Miyuto min Hamarav, the smallest was from the west. So comparing on the north-south axis, according to this interpretation, if Rubam and Hadarom and only Shlishim and Hatzafon, so the distance between the north wall of the Azara to the north wall of the Harabayas is much smaller than the distance between the south wall of the Harabayas and the south wall of the Azara. And we know that the entire distance, the entire width of the Azara was only 135. So we know that there must have been a fair distance between the south wall of the Harabayas and the south wall of the Azara. The Tosas Yom gives examples of what the numbers might have been. Again, we don't have exact numbers, but he says perhaps if we take for example, if we say that the 187, the length of the Azara was 187, and the total length of the Harabayas was 500, that means there were 313 amos. That means that there were 313, and we can divide it that we can divide it into two groups. He says, and well, then he goes all the way around. If we take 500 minus 135, we're left with 365. And so that on the north-south axis, if we have 500 from north to south, and the width of the Azara was only 135, and we know that the south was much larger than the north. So, for example, he says that perhaps it would be that there would be 250 amas to the south, between the south wall of the Harabayas and the Azara, and then the Azara itself of 135, and to the north was only maybe 115. Those numbers are not necessarily compelling, but that's an example of what it would have looked like. There is a Rush who understands differently. The Rush says that the Mishnah is not telling you about the space between the south wall of the Harabayas and the Azara, and the north wall of the Harabayas and the north wall of the Azara. It's rather telling you where the Azara and its buildings were. Ruba min Adaram means just the opposite. Most of the base of Mikdash was B'daram. On the north-south axis, most of the Mikdash was in the southern half rather than the northern half. Exactly the opposite of the Rambam. This machlokus has significant practical import. Bisman hazeh, there are some Rabbanim who allow entry to the Harabayas. The Tumah issues that are relevant to Harabayas are solvable, according to many poskim at least. The Azara, the rules of Tumah and the Azara are much stricter. So people who enter the Harabayas are willing to do so if they can be reasonably sure that they're not entering the Azara. So inside the Kosel already is the Harabayas, according to most poskim, but you can't step foot into the Azara. So we have to be sure that we know where the Azara is, or at least we know that it's not here, the place we want to go. So depending on how you understand this Mishnah, you can decide, if you're going from the south, for example, how many amas do I have before I have to worry about maybe this is where the Azara is. So Rav Shlomo Goren, for example, was one of the ones who argued that it would be permissible to enter the Harabayas. He made assumptions. He followed the opinion of the Rambam that the largest space, the largest gap was between the south wall of the Harabayas and the Azara, and he therefore allowed entry into a certain portion of the lower part of the Harabayas. Others disagreed. Others objected that we have to consider the Rush as well. That on the contrary, the Azara was displaced toward the southern wall of the Harabayas. Many other objections as well, both to Rav Goren's specific calculations as well as to the whole idea of entry into the Harabayas. But the point is that this Mishnah our Gemara brings about the dimensions of the Azara being 187 by 135, combined with the two other facts that the Harabayas was 500 by 500, and the third fact that the Ruba min Adaram, and so on. That's what gives us at least a start toward figuring out what assumptions we can make about where the Azara was within the larger square of the Harabayas. On Daf Yud Zayin, the Gemara talks again about this principle of Kalpina Shatapona, that you should always go liyamin, that the Kalpina Shatapona Eladerach Yamin. The Gemara has a question that the Gemara explains on this daf, on Daf Yud Zayin. The Gemara explains that certain Mishnayos where we're describing the order in which certain offices, certain rooms in the Beis HaMikdash were. And the Gemara made in Ukimta that one Tana is counting clockwise and one Tana is counting counterclockwise. Marka Chashuv Derech Yamin, Marka Chashuv Derech Smol. One of them is counting Derech Yamin. If you start on the south and then you start circling, you first turn to the right. And so you go from the south, you go to the east, and then the north, and then the west. So that's counterclockwise. We're calling that liyamin. If you start from the south, you make a right turn, and then you start circling counterclockwise. And the other Tana counts the offices in the other direction. That's derech smol. That's clockwise, because when you start from the south, you turn to the left, and then you first go to the west. So you're going clockwise, and that is called derech smol. So the Gemara says, derech smol, why would a Tana count the offices derech smol? We just said that the rule is you should always go liyamin. You should always turn to the yamin. So the Gemara says, you're right. When a person does a mitzvah, when a person does something of religious significance, he's supposed to go to the right, wherever he has a choice. But this is mer chushbana ba'almahu. No one's doing anything. No one's actually going anywhere. We're talking about a description. We're talking about a description in the Mishnah of how to enumerate the offices. So a description can enumerate them in a clockwise direction, even though that hypothetically would mean making a left turn to begin. There's an interesting tshuva Rav Menashe Klein wrote to Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt. Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt wanted to know, how far do we take this rule that you should always turn to the right? The examples we brought earlier, the Gemara's examples, the examples the post can bring, are always about various mitzvahs, or at least religious activities, taking the Torah out of the Aron, lighting Ner Chanukah, and so on. do we apply this rule that you should always turn to the right on matters of rishus, on matters that are not of any religious significance? Rabbi Greenblatt's example was someone has 2 columns of figures to tally. Should he start from the right one, even if it would be easier to? Does he have to start from the right one, even if the left one would be easier? So Rav Menashe Klein brings our Gemara and says that our Gemara says chushbana, you don't have to go derech yamin. Only avoda, which is a mitzvah, he says you have to go derech yamin. But mir chushbana is not. So you don't have to go derech yamin. So his first suggestion was that anything which is not religious, that's what the Gemara means by saying chushbana. Anything which is not a mitzvah, which is not an avoda or a mitzvah or a darash b'kedusha, is like chushbana, and you don't have to go liyamin. Then he suggests a narrower interpretation of chushbana. He says that anything that you do, anything that you actually do, any activity that you do, you should go liyamin. Chushbana is a mere abstraction; it's a description. But if you're actually calculating and writing, he says maybe that actually should be liyamin. Harisha Nira, he says, but he's inclined to the lenient view that anything that's derech rishus, that's not a question of mitzvah, it's not an act of religious significance, we don't apply the rule that you need to go derech yamin. On Daf Yud Ches, the Mishnah says that when they would prepare the Kohen Gadol for the Avodah of Yom Kippur, they would appoint 2 Zekanim, 2 Talmidei Chachamim, and they would teach him the Seder Hayom, what he would have to do on Yom Kippur, and they would tell him, read it, we have to study this. Why? Shema shachachta, maybe you once knew this but you've forgotten it, or Shema lo lamadta, maybe you never even learned it, maybe you're an ignoramus who never even learned the Avodah. The Gemara says, shachach, fine, people forget things. Even the Kohen Gadol might have forgotten some of the laws of the Avodah. Shema lo lamad, he never learned the Avodah. You appoint a Kohen Gadol who's such an ignoramus, he doesn't know the basic halacha. The Gemara brings a brisa. It says the halacha is a Kohen Hagadol me'achav, that a Kohen Gadol has to be greater than his peers. B'koach, b'noi, b'chachmo, v'osher. He has to be a greater Talmid Chacham than them. He can't appoint an ignoramus for a Kohen Gadol. Rav Yosef says, lo kasha. You're right. The ideal halacha and the practice was in Mikdash Rishon was they used to appoint only Talmidei Chachamim, only the greatest Chacham. Mikdash Sheni, the system was unfortunately not that good. Mikdash Sheni, people used to be appointed even if they were ignoramuses. And they did not always appoint the most suitable person. And as proof of this, in support of this, the Gemara brings an infamous incident where Tarkava de Dinri Ailale Marta Bas Baitus, a very rich woman named Marta Bas Baitus, paid an enormous amount of money, Liyanai Malka, to King Yanai, to appoint Yeshua ben Gamla. Rashi says that was her husband, that to appoint her husband as the Kohen Gadol, to appoint him as the Kohen Gadol. So you see that in the Bayis Sheni, people they weren't so meticulous about appointing the best person for the job. The system was corrupt, and it was unfortunate, but it wasn't the way things should be. So that's why you can have a Kohen Gadol who was an ignoramus, because they appointed people for venal reasons. The Gemara discusses this in Yevamis as well. The Gemara says, the Mishnah Yevamis brings this story as well. It says, Yeshua ben Gamla, when he married Marta Bas Baitus, the king appointed him as the Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara over there says that the language is Minahu HaMelech Lios Kohen Gadol. The king appointed him, but apparently it wasn't something that the other Kohanim in the Sanhedrin went along with. They were not happy with this appointment. Why not? So the Gemara says again, Rav Asi said because he was appointed due to money, a large cash payment was made to Yanai Malka to appoint Yeshua ben Gamla. And the Gemara calls this Katir Kachazina Hacha. It's a kesher. This was a plot. This was not legitimate. This was a plot. Our Gemara clearly implies that as well. That unlike Bayis Rishon, where they appointed deserving Kohanim Gedolim, here this was an inappropriate plot. Rashi says, what is Katir? Katir is Kesher Shel Rishayim. This was rishus to do this. So both Gemaras criticize the system in general of appointing Kohanim Gedolim, in particular this episode where Yeshua ben Gamla was appointed as the Kohen Gadol. There is a major disagreement, however, as to whether Yeshua ben Gamla himself, was he indeed a Talmid Chacham and a worthy person or not. Rashi in Yevamis explains that Shelo HaYaroi Lekach, he was not deserving of being the Kohen Gadol, whether he was a complete ignoramus or just wasn't the most deserving candidate, he was not deserving, Rashi says, and they appointed him anyway. Tosfos Yeshanim says the same thing in our Gemara. Tosfos Yeshanim says he wasn't a total ignoramus, he was an Adam Chashuv. Later in the Masechta, it says that he made an important donation to the to the. He donated Garolos for the use of Yom Kippur, and they were Mazkiros L'Shvach. And the Gemara in Le'achbar says the famous Takana of Yeshua ben Gamla, he instituted a system of education for children. So apparently he was an Adam Chashuv. Nevertheless, he says he was not. There were people greater than him. There were people more deserving of him. Balei Torah and Chashuvim Mimenu. He wasn't really the most deserving candidate. So similar to what Rashi says, it was wrong to appoint him because he was not the most deserving candidate. So that's what some Rishonim say. The Bach, however, learns differently. The Bach in Choshen Mishpat, the Bach says he actually was a perfectly deserving candidate. Ein Safek, the Bach says. The Bach says, indubitably, he was Ra'ili as Kohen Gadol in terms of his Chachma, and in terms of what he knew about the Avoda, and he was the Yarei Shemayim, and maybe even in terms of his Chashivos, maybe he deserved to be the Kohen Gadol. He was first among equals. Nevertheless, what was wrong was that they paid for it. The Bach learns from this, the way he understands this, not like the Rishonim apparently. The Bach understands even someone who's entirely deserving, who might be the most deserving candidate anyway, if you pay for that, that's an avla. That's called kesher shel rishoyim. So that's what the Bach paskins. The Bach rules that the Bach first says that there's an isser. The post can bring this an isser to appoint someone because of money. And the Bach says that this isser of appointing someone because of money, that isser is only someone who's not deserving, he's not a Talmud Chacham, and you appoint him because of money. That's an isser. However, he says if someone is a Chacham, then even if he gets appointed because he's rich, people want to curry favor with him, people are impressed by the fact that he's rich. If he is indeed a Talmud Chacham and deserving, then we don't have this isser of lo sas and iti, elohei chesef. You don't have this isser. Even if they appoint him because he's rich, that's then you don't have this isser. However, the Bach says that's only if he doesn't pay the money. If people are moved or influenced by his wealth and they appoint him and he's deserving, that's okay. However, the Bach says if money is paid, if money changes hands by Martabas Baitos, in the case of the Gemara, to appoint him even though he's fully deserving, that the Bach says is a problem. Then Asr Lamanu Panav, we can't respect him, we can't acknowledge his appointment. That the Bach Taka Paskins, if someone's position is bought, even though he's deserving, that's an avla, and we have to protest, we have to object to that kind of appointment. So, and other Acharim also, the Ksos HaChoshen accept this Bach, even though the Chazim Sofer and others point out that his understanding of the Gemara is against the Rishonim. The Rishonim actually said that Yeshua ben Gamla was not the most deserving person. Rashi says, Lo ha'yaroi lekach. Tos Yeshanim says there were others greater than him. The Bach says he might have been the greatest, and still there's an avla in paying money, and the Bach and other Acharim therefore conclude that to buy a position, even if you deserve it, even if you're equally qualified as everyone else or more qualified, to pay money to get a position, that's wrong, and we have to refuse to acknowledge such a corrupt appointment.